My grandfather McCord wrote that everything that ever happened to him in his life, both good and bad, was the result of his Scottish heritage. My grandfather believed himself to be, like all Scotsmen, proud, stubborn, responsible, thrifty, and loyal. Those characteristics sealed his fate. Today, the idea that your family's national origin determines your character is quaint. Well, okay, I guess it can be downright racist. But I tend to cut my grandfather a lot of slack. He was born at the end of the 19th century when this idea was accepted wisdom. Plus, he had a whole lot of evidence to support his beliefs, at least as far as the McCord family history is concerned. My grandfather's grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, Joseph McCord, grew up in New Jersey, the son of Scottish immigrants. His immigrant farm family did well enough that Joseph was able to go to his local college, which happened to be Princeton University. Joseph graduated from Princeton in 1819, and before long, he was the superintendent of schools in Hackettstown, New Jersey. He had a salary of more than $80 a month. That was pretty good money back in those days. It was enough money that he was able to buy a lovely stone house there in Hackettstown, which was the envy of some of his neighbors who lived in cheaper wooden houses. It appeared that Joseph was going to be a confirmed bachelor, but at the age of 41, he married a younger woman who was teaching in one of his schools. Her name was Margaret Sarah Armstrong, also a Scottish immigrant, in case you hadn't guessed. At first, it looked like they had it made. They had great jobs. They had that beautiful stone house. But in the 1840s, they suffered a series of misfortunes. 3 of their 5 children died in early childhood. Joseph particularly mourned the loss of his firstborn son at the age of 2. At the end of that decade, there was a financial crisis. Joseph lost his stone house to foreclosure, something which he hadn't even realized was possible. In 1850, the family decided to start over, and they moved out west to the relatively young state of Cleveland, Ohio, where Joseph got a job managing a school in Cleveland, a school that was sponsored by the Presbyterian Church. Once again, his salary was in excess of $80 a month. It looked good. But this was the 1850s, and before long, the church was deeply divided over the bitter issue of slavery. Joseph had moderate political views, but very strong religious convictions. He loudly proclaimed, "I will happily take communion at the side of a slave or a slave owner. It makes no difference to me." This managed to piss off both sides of the debate, and Joseph was promptly fired, as he probably knew that he would be. Joseph was stubborn about it. You could say it was just his foolish Scottish pride, but for Joseph, it was a matter of principle. Joseph got another job at a rural school in Ohio, but before long he caught ill and died. He was only 55 years old. He left no estate for his family. Now, Margaret Sarah found herself a young widow with 2 children to care for. Her daughter Cora was 8 years old. Her son Marshall, my great-grandfather, was only 5. Margaret Sarah moved to Pennsylvania, where she set up a series of private schools to support her family, but they all failed, each one after the other, until finally, desperate for money, Margaret Sarah decided to put her kids to work. Cora was sent into town to work for a dressmaker. Marshall, at the age of 12, was sent to Scranton to work as a telegraph assistant, where he earned $10 a month. He could barely afford a room in a boarding house, which he shared with 2 strange men who were probably also down on their luck. It was a tough life for a 12-year-old. But before long, Marshall became a full-fledged telegraph operator, and his salary rose to $78 a month, almost what his father had earned when his father bought that lovely stone house in Hackettstown. The family began to feel secure again. The telegraph was the internet of the day. Operators were needed 24/7 all over the country. With Marshall's mastery of this new technology, he would never want for work again. In 1867, at the age of 20, Marshall went to a revival meeting, and he heard the call of the Lord. Marshall decided that henceforth he would devote his Sabbath to prayer and Bible study. When he told his employers that he would no longer work on Sundays, he was promptly fired, as he probably knew that he would be. Marshall got a job as a telegraph operator for the post office, which closed on Sundays. That paid $50 a month. The family suffered financially. They fell behind in their rent. They had to move to cheaper housing. Seeking advancement during a telegrapher strike, Marshall got a job as a telegraph operator at a hotel in Baltimore. It paid $70 a month. But there was a misunderstanding about the terms of employment, and when Marshall said that he wouldn't work on Sundays, he was fired again. Marshall was stubborn about it. You could say it was his foolish Scottish pride, but for Marshall, it was a matter of principle. Throughout the 1870s, the family struggled, but eventually Marshall got on his feet. He married. When his first wife died, he remarried, and he actually inherited a house from his second wife's family, so he was a homeowner in middle age. Marshall was the father of my grandfather, whose name was also Marshall McCord, and my grandfather was the product of his father's second marriage. He was only 12 years old when his father died. Once again, the family began to suffer financial hardship. My grandfather had to finish high school early at the age of 16 and go to work to be the family's primary breadwinner. His dreams of going to college the way his grandfather had were financially impossible. My grandfather went to work for an accountant who took a shining to and helped him earn his own CPA certification. Eventually, my grandfather rose to be the treasurer of the Davison Chemical Company in Baltimore, an executive position which he held for almost 25 years. He was able to give his 3 kids the college education that he never had for himself. In 1947, the son of the president of the Davison Chemical Company got involved in the business, and my grandfather detected some financial irregularities. He wrote a letter to the board of directors outlining his concerns and saying that he would not work with the son of the president of the company. My grandfather was promptly fired, as he probably knew that he would be. If he'd stayed just a little bit longer, he would have qualified for a full pension. But my grandfather was stubborn about it. You could say it was just his foolish Scottish pride, but for him, it was a matter of principle. My grandfather landed okay. He was an experienced CPA with unimpeachable integrity, and the family never suffered financially again. So those are my McCord ancestors, and I know what you're thinking. You're wondering, so Bill, when did you lose a job over a matter of principle? In 1989, I was a newly minted government contracting officer in the U.S. Foreign Service. It was the end of the fiscal year, which is always a crazy time for government employees, particularly those of us who work in procurement. I got a phone call from a security office which suggested that I could falsify some documents so that my embassy would be eligible for end-of-the-year funding that we wouldn't otherwise qualify for. Really, all I had to do was fudge some dates. It would be a victimless crime, and nobody would profit from this personally, and the embassy would get a badly needed security upgrade. I knew that if I said no, a lot of people would be really angry at me. I didn't think I'd get fired on the spot. Government doesn't work that way. But they have ways of getting rid of employees they don't like. You get a bad performance appraisal. You get the lousy job assignments. Your coworkers snub you. I knew it could happen. I didn't sign, of course. I mean, after all, it was a matter of principle. And for a couple of weeks, a lot of people were angry at me, especially the security people. And then a senior embassy officer in a staff meeting commended me for doing the right thing, and that was pretty much the end of it. So why did my ancestors get fired and I didn't? What broke the chain? Well, I think it was the luck of the Irish. Okay, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but Bill, you're Scottish and not Irish, and that's a totally different thing. Yes, thanks to my grandfather, I'm very aware of and very proud of my Scottish heritage. But one thing some of us have learned in modern times is those old ethnic stereotypes don't always play out the way people used to believe they did. Thank you.